After the recent announcement of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, I thought it would be a good time to talk about dark fantasy. From what I can tell, dark fantasy seems to be one of the most popular subgenres among players and dungeon masters, and D&D is more than capable of supporting it. At the same time, it's not quite as easy to run as a straightforward heroic adventure, and you'll need to take some special measures to make sure that your players are taking the dark nature of the game seriously. Before I get into the list, I should probably answer the question, what is dark fantasy? To me, it's fantasy mixed with horror, and not just in the sense that it often includes classic horror creatures like werewolves and zombies. A good horror movie will give the audience a constant sense of dread, and the same should be true for your players in a dark fantasy game. The world should suck, and the PC's lives should suck even harder. The heroes are just trying to get by in a world where anything horrible could be right around the corner, and the only thing that they truly understand is that everything there is trying to kill them. For this video, I'm assuming that the party is mostly made up of relatively decent people that stand in contrast to the monsters they fight, even if they sometimes act for themselves or occasionally have no choice but to leave others to die. If the PCs are straight up villains or some type of evil mercenaries, then the campaign could probably still be classed as dark, but some of the tips in this video wouldn't apply, so that's a topic for another time. The Evil Campaigns video is coming, I promise. For now, onto the list. My first tip is to give the players tough choices. In a good dark fantasy campaign, the world should be a horrible place, and saving everyone should be completely off the table. You should include scenes in your campaign that highlight this, particularly the idea that benevolent magic is preciously scarce. If the PCs have only one potion of greater restoration, then they should come across a child afflicted with a deadly curse, forcing them to either give up their own safety, or leave the child to eventually become a horrid monster. Magic item use should always have a price, whether an item has to draw the user's blood, or risks attracting demons when activated. Your world should be so full of darkness that even the noblest of heroes will sometimes need to step out of the light. My next tip is to make sure that no place is truly safe. Kill off NPCs left and right, no matter how hardened or innocent they might have seemed. Have monsters ambush the heroes during rests. Even in places where you don't feel like throwing in a whole encounter, you can leave plenty of signs of danger wherever the PCs are exploring, like giant footprints or unintelligible whispers. If the PCs have a home base like a tavern or fortress, then it should be haunted, or populated by sketchy NPCs, or maybe just have it be invaded by zombies if the heroes get too comfortable there. It should be credible that next to no adventurers will ever make it to the higher levels. Next up, you should use monsters that the players aren't familiar with. Dark fantasy is often associated with classic horror creatures like vampires, werewolves, zombies, and the like. While these creatures can help set the vibe of your game, they aren't very threatening to most players today. I totally agree with the idea that the most powerful form of fear is fear of the unknown. And when a creature has already been deconstructed, humanized, parodied, reimagined, or just plain overdone by pop culture, it's more likely to elicit snores and laughs than scares or thrills. Plus, part of what used to make these monsters so threatening is that they were seemingly impossible to kill. Nowadays, everybody knows that vampires are killed by sunlight, zombies by decapitation, and werewolves by silver. And that'll make them less threatening to your players, even if their characters logically shouldn't be aware of this. You can still use these monsters for your campaign, especially as minions that aren't driving the conflict by themselves. But if you want them to be truly threatening in their own right, then you should add something to them that the players won't expect. Maybe your vampires can steal spellcasting power just as easily as health, or your werewolves can actually transform into any animal ranging from bears to eagles. Or you can focus on creatures that are less homogeneous in terms of abilities, like demons or Lovecraftian horrors. You might want to look into some homebrew creatures, or even design your own, especially if your players are the type to read through the entire monster manual and memorize each creature's vulnerabilities. Similarly, to keep the players and their characters on their toes, you should include an encounter every so often that the heroes can't solve just by fighting whatever's in front of them. In a typical dark fantasy world, you'll want to drive home the idea that no one can ever fully rid the world of evil. And if the solution to every problem is to just pull out a sword and kill the bad guy, then it'll seem like evil isn't really unstoppable, no matter how many bad guys there are. If you include other types of encounters, then you can really heighten the sense of dread. The most obvious example is a threat so physically powerful that the heroes have no choice but to either run or hide, which is a type of encounter that I think you should include at least one of in a dark fantasy campaign. But there are other things that you can do to highlight the powerlessness of humanity, such as adding a threat that's completely incorporeal. Maybe there's a haunted mirror where one can occasionally spot a malevolent spirit behind their own reflection that curses anyone who looks upon her. The only way to break the curse is to reunite the spirit with her husband, who happens to be a demon lord. With this approach, there can be plenty of overlap with my previous tip about giving the players tough choices, none of which leave humanity on top. My final piece of advice is to realize that the campaign will probably get progressively less dark as the characters level up. During those first few levels, the PCs are going to feel vulnerable. They might have some useful skills or minor supernatural powers, but in a world full of evil, death can be delivered by just about anything. But by the time they reach 5th level or so, they become noticeably superhuman, able to shoot a perfectly accurate arrow in less than 2 seconds, or fall 50 feet and fight on like nothing's happened. At this point, it's pretty much impossible to do straight-up horror, but I think it can still qualify as dark fantasy as long as evil is still more powerful than good. At some point, though, if the PCs keep leveling up, they'll be able to do things like resurrect the dead or teleport between planes of existence. No dark story that I can think of has that level of power in the hands of clearly heroic characters, since at that point, they're no longer just trying to survive in a bleak world, but instead they legitimately seem like they can push back against whatever ultimate evil is plaguing the world in the first place. Because of this, if you're running a dark fantasy game, I think that you should plan on either stopping at a relatively low level or eventually changing the tone of the campaign. You could also just make encounters so difficult that you don't expect the PCs to survive past the first few levels, but reward them if they manage to pull it off. That does necessitate a very combat-focused game, but it could be a lot of fun with the right group of people. So yeah, that's it. Let me know what you think of this advice, or if you have any of your own for running a dark fantasy game. I'm definitely thinking of making some more subgenre related videos in the future, so let me know if there's any that you're interested in. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.